Hello everybody, welcome. My name is Fergus McNeill. I am a Professor of Criminology at the University of Glasgow, but more importantly I'm the Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Howard League for Penal Reform, so it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight and thank you for coming. It's so nice to be back here and to be in a real room with three-dimensional human beings. It still feels like a novelty to me, so definitely worth the trip from Glasgow. Welcome to this year's Parmoor Lecture. By way of background, the lecture is held in memory of Lord Parmoor, whose name was Milo Cripps. He was a dedicated and enthusiastic supporter of the work of the Howard League and also a donor. In fact, it was his contributions to our work which helped us to build and establish, not build, buy and establish our headquarters many years ago. We set up the lecture series in his name to honour his contribution. He died in 2008, but we remember him each year. We also want to thank Clifford Chance for hosting us again. This is, well, it's not the 15th time they've hosted us because we've missed a couple because of the pandemic, but we've been here since 2007. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to Clifford Chance, which I want to acknowledge here. Liz Moroney, our Vice Chair, isn't available to be with us tonight, but she's being ably deputised for by Tom Dunn, who's here. So Tom welcomes you on behalf of Clifford Chance. Okay, I think that's all the... Oh, I've forgotten the housekeeping, the inevitable housekeeping. There is no plan for a fire drill. If you hear one, like an alarm going off, just run like hell. That's not what it says here. It says, we do not have any planned fire drills today, so if you hear a fire announcement, please follow these instructions. Should we need to evacuate, venue staff will direct you to the nearest fire exit. Fire exits in this room are the doors you entered from. There's also either side of the podium. I think that's it. There's nothing else that needs to be said about housekeeping. So let me get on with introducing Andrea, our Chief Executive and your speaker. Andrea was Director of Justice from 2013 to 2021. During that time, she led a period of significant growth in the size and the impact of that organisation. Before that, between 2002 and 2013, she was Equality Lawyer and then Legal Director at Interrights, litigating strategic cases before regional human rights courts. She previously worked at the International Service for Human Rights in Geneva and the South Asia Documentation Centre in New Delhi. She's qualified as a barrister and solicitor in Australia, holds degrees from the University of Western Australia and the London School of Economics. She sits on the advisory panels of various human rights organisations. She's an honorary master of the Bench of Middle Temple. Don't know if that's a Harry Potter related role or something else, but it sounds impressive. And she's also an affiliate member of the Centre for Law and Social Justice at the University of Leeds, which is decent because it's halfway to Glasgow, so could be better. Since 2019, she has served as a lay member of the House of Lords Conduct Committee. No questions about that, please. In 2022, Andrea was appointed Queen's Counsel Honoris Causa. Did I do that right in Latin? Yeah. Didn't teach it in Barhead High School. Okay. Anyway, she's that for making a major contribution to the development of the law in England and Wales. So it's my pleasure to invite Andrea to the podium to talk to us about Son of a Convict, Law, Human Rights and the Politics of Punishment.
A little disorganised. My apologies also for my bandana look. I had some recent treatment and I have to cover up my forehead. So I'm not wanting to start a Bon Jovi tribute band, or I'm not a North London hipster, all the things I've been accused of being over the last few 2 months. It is a huge privilege to speak to you tonight and to deliver this lecture in honour of Lord Parmoor. One of my dearest friends is an antiquarian book dealer, and when I told him I was giving this lecture, he was rapturous about the reputation of Milo Cripps in their industry for his talent, his kindness, and apparently most importantly, his sense of fun. And we certainly at the Howard League are enormously grateful for his philanthropic contribution to us. It's lovely to see so many friends, embarrassing numbers of people from Justice here. Francis Crook, whose shoes I fill, was a big personality. And since I've been appointed, a lot of people have asked of our staff, who is she? What's she like? I'm not going to answer that. You can make that up yourself. And how did she come to be at the Howard League? And so tonight I'm going to start to answer some of those questions. And I'm then going to share some of my early thoughts about prison reform. At this stage, very much the observations of somebody who's still sort of on the outside. And I'll end up with some thoughts on the kinds of things that I think you can expect from the Howard League under my leadership, subject to Fergus's and the board's approval. First to me, I've called the lecture Son of a Convict because one of my earliest memories is of being in bustling markets in Fiji, aged about 2 or 3, where we lived at the time. And I'd accompany my mum. She'd bargain to buy our food. And whenever she bargained too hard, which was all the time, the market sellers would start shouting at her that she was the son of a convict, a local term for Australians who were going too hard at the market. Mum hated it. It really embarrassed her. And in no small part because it was true. In the 70s, being descended from convicts, as her side of the family was something that Australians kept to themselves. I'm pleased to say that the intergenerational shame has abated over my lifetime, such that 6 years ago, I think Adrian might have been there, when I was made an honorary master of the bench at Middle Temple, which is definitely a very Harry Potter place, I mentioned my convict ancestors, and I said that they'd be spinning in their graves, that I'd been accepted by the legal establishment in such a warm embrace. And afterwards, a couple of horrified, retired senior judges came up to me just to check that I'd been joking, much to the amusement of a few others who knew that I had not been. And the truth is that a good number of my ancestors were poor, working-class people who committed crimes and faced transportation. My 7 times great-grandfather, William Bufton, worked in a soap factory in Southampton to support his wife and his 9 children. In 1851, he was convicted of stealing taro from the factory, his soap factory he worked at, and with 279 men was transported on the Marion to Western Australia. He served his sentence, he built up the colony as a convict labourer, and aged 50, my age now, he was pardoned and was joined by his family. William died in 1871, and he remains the only person buried in East Perth Cemetery whose tombstone faces not towards the setting sun, but towards the coast, which I think is better anyway. But that is because no one is to forget that he was a convict. And I come from a country founded as a penal colony, with racism at its core. When I went to law school, we were taught that Australia was terra nullius, a land without people, when it was colonised. And I was in my 3rd year of law school before the Mabo judgment came along and corrected that. And growing up, I saw racism really close. My dad had a job in the bank, a clerical job, which had taken us to Fiji. And then on return to Australia, we moved to the bush. And I spent most of my primary school years living in really small country towns in what we call the bush, near nowhere. From an early age, I saw really high levels of alcoholism, poverty, violence, and an underclass of Aboriginal people, Indigenous people. For a lot of my classmates, going to prison was a cultural rite of passage. All of their relatives had been to prison, and it was something that a lot of them were doing before I'd finished high school. And there was always a lot of talk amongst my class schoolmates about prison, visiting relatives and whatever, that sparked a lifelong interest for me. There wasn't a high school in our town, and so the bank paid for me to go to a private school in the city. And that education and the opportunities that afforded me is the reason that I'm here today. I did really well in school. I got involved in debating at a national level with Carol Nairn, wherever she is in the audience, who's here tonight and remains a rock. And ultimately I went to law school because I didn't have the stomach to study medicine. I always wanted to help people. I had understood that I'd been really lucky in my life, and I felt an urge to give back. And so I did a history degree, then a law degree, and realised that while I didn't like reading judgments at all, and still don't, law could be a powerful tool for social change. I'm pretty sure I'm the QC in the country who's read the fewest judgments. I'm 100% sure. I qualified as a barrister and solicitor in Western Australia and swiftly made my escape to India, where I worked for the then leading human rights organisation in South Asia. It was based in New Delhi, and we took on individual cases. And on my first day, I was allocated a case of a man who'd been an under trial in Calcutta. He'd been awaiting trial, an under trial as it's termed in Indian legal parlance, for 22 years. I started reading into his case on Monday, and that Thursday he died. He was 41, he'd been in prison since he was 19, I'd never tried, never convicted, dead in a Calcutta prison. And for the next few years I worked on lots of similar sorts of cases, civil and political rights cases, torture, executions, freedom of religion, speech. I worked on the treatment of women in Indian prisons and worked with refugees. Regularly, old Afghan men were trying to explain what had happened to them and would take off their shirts to show me the scars from their torture or to show me pictures of their children whose decapitated bodies had been mutilated by the Mujahideen. It was pretty challenging work for a 25-year-old, but it gave me a strong stomach and a motivation to work in human rights. After India, I worked in Geneva in the UN system for a year and then did my master's at LSE in public international law, and then I moved to Cairo to be with my then partner. And I was saved from riding my horse around the pyramids every day by getting a job at Interrights, which had been set up by Anthony Lester 20 years earlier. My time in Geneva had turned me against international politics in the context of human rights. Too many governments buying off small governments by building bridges. And it returned me to law as a tool. My boss in India, Ravi, who was a journalist, had always said that you can talk about torture as much as you like at fancy conferences, and you can elaborate endless protocols. But it's not until you have police officers in the dock for beating confessions out of criminals, out of suspects, that anything will ever change. And so Interrights allowed me to use litigation to change law. So for the next 10 years, I worked with local partners in Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union countries, in Africa, to bring test cases to regional human rights courts. This was strategic litigation. The goal of the litigation was to help more than the individual person, but to use their case to challenge bad laws, practices, policies through the courts. And every one of our cases was a David and Goliath sort of contest. My client, the human rights victim, against the mighty state, which had violated their rights. And because justice and evidence was on our side, we rarely lost. Before becoming the legal director, most of my cases were on equality. I worked on the first indirect discrimination case before the Strasbourg court, cases of sexual harassment, a lot of rape and domestic violence cases, including the first judgment of the Strasbourg court that domestic violence was a public rather than private concern, and then on Opus in Turkey, which was the first time that the European Court had found a failure to protect against domestic violence being sex discrimination under the Convention. I worked with amazing, brave clients and courageous lawyers who worked in hugely challenging circumstances. And while I wasn't a prison specialist, because I'd always loved prisons, I would use every opportunity to go to them wherever I was. One of the best things I worked on actually at Interrights was with my friend, the incredible Egyptian human rights activist and journalist Hossam Bagat. And we used the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to release several men who'd been held in shocking conditions, tortured, forgotten in underground cells in Cairo jail, imprisoned for years in some cases for their religious beliefs. The Egyptian government at the time was so committed to regional human rights arrangements at the African Commission that it released the men when we agreed to drop the cases. They knew that they were going to lose, and they couldn't bear the international shame and loss of face for being a human rights violator. In 2022, in Britain, the idea of fearing international shame for abusing human rights in a human rights ruling seems pretty wonderful, if a little bit unrealistic. After 10 years at Interrights and nursing a baby, I was approached to apply for the job as Director of Justice. Alexandra Marks, who's here, who supported the Howard League for years, was on the Justice Board and the Interrights Board, and she encouraged me. Justice is a membership body, a charity, you should all join, can't help myself. And for 60 years, they've been doing fantastic work to change the legal system to make it fairer and more accessible. and with the Justice's amazing staff and supporters, or return justice to its roots of reimagining how the system could work. We did lots of work dragging the system into the 21st century, and in respect of crime, looked at big challenges, the criminal courts. In the criminal courts, we looked at how to deal with defendants' mental health problems, the prosecution of sexual offences, racial disparity in youth justice, and most recently, and published after my departure, the operation of the parole board, which couldn't be more important. As the pandemic hit, we held the world's first trials, a virtual jury trial, academically, independently assessed, and ensured that they were ensuring participation in a fair trial. They've been picked up quite well in Scotland. While Justice's work stopped at sentence, I took every opportunity I could to go into prisons. I attended lots of parole board hearings to get a glimpse behind the prison gate. Most often, the prisoners involved would be the adult version of the kids I went to school with, people who'd grown up with few opportunities, some of whom couldn't read, who'd taken bad decisions in bad circumstances, struggling with drugs, alcohol, without social scaffolding of support that I've always taken for granted. The final thing I did at Justice that cemented my route here is that one Sunday afternoon, about 5 years ago, I went up to Cambridge to give a lecture about my career. Over drinks afterwards, I was approached by this very beautiful young man who introduced himself to me as Jack Merritt. And he told me that he ran a course at HMP Warren Hill called the Butler Law Course as part of Learning Together. He thought I might find it interesting and that his students would love to hear from me. And for the next couple of years, I taught on the course, working with Jack and with his students, whom I found to be completely remarkable. Most of them were lifers, mostly convicted of murder, although a good number of them had never actually killed anyone because they had been convicted for 20 plus years, sentenced 20 plus years for joint enterprise murder, which means it's a legal outrage that overwhelmingly criminalises young black boys for the company they keep, and on which you can expect to hear more from us in the future. Most of the students at Warren Hill were like my relative, William Bufton, poor, working class, minority communities, hadn't enjoyed school, had not engaged with education at all. Many of them had been told that they were dumb and they just shouldn't bother to go to school. And yet here they were, reading, discussing Supreme Court judgments, reflecting with maturity and insight into the operation of the criminal justice system, suggesting ways that the system could work better. A number were exceptionally bright, including one man who was frequently and successfully judicially reviewing the prison. Others were talented actors, musicians, writers. There was an award-winning poet. And a number of them had been convicted as children, have since had favourable tariff reviews, meaning that they've had their sentences reduced for exceptional progress, progress that the sentencing judge could never have possibly foreseen, and I find myself incredibly proud of them. The course was run with kindness and respect and opened my eyes both to the power of education to change lives, but also to the incredible resource of talented, bright people locked up for years and years on end. I'm pleased to say the first person that we've recruited since I've been at the Howard League, since I've joined, through a competitive process, I'll make clear, was the man who led the course when I first went to Warren Hill, Steve Gallant, who's here tonight somewhere, and whose upcoming book I will be forcing on you all to buy in a year's time. So to the Howard League. I've been at the Howard League, a member of the Howard League for a number of years. I sought the role with a mix of heart and head. The heart was William Bufton and Jack Merritt and the men at Warren Hill, and the head was the potential of blending litigation with policy and campaigns work to reform a failing prison system, a system that we all know doesn't work. I've inherited an amazing organisation, staff and legacy, bolstered in size and in profile by Francis. The Howard League has achieved a huge amount over its history, and every day I am completely inspired by the commitment and drive of our staff, whether they're dealing with the press, taking evidence for reports, taking calls from children in custody. They change people's lives in prison every day. Unfortunately, the Howard League's voice is more necessary than ever before. I've spent much of the last 6 months talking to our members, to partners and to others in the sector, and have been blown away by the goodwill for the Howard League and for the support of our core vision of less crime, safer communities and fewer people in prison. It's like I planned that. Only yesterday I was at a HMPPS Insights, a prison service Insights event in Warwickshire, and a number of people came up to me afterwards to say, I'm really glad you're here, because the Howard League can say stuff that we think, but we can't possibly say. So it's good that you said it. And I've heard that a lot in recent months. People saying, we believe what you say, but we just can't say it because it's not our place. And I don't sense any bad sort of will actors in the space. Everybody from prison leavers to prison governors and civil servants and NGO actors, everyone understands that our system can and must do better. Before I start talking about prison, we've got to the bit of the speech where I'm no longer the expert. I'm definitely the expert on myself. I am not the expert yet on prison reform, and I'm conscious that this room is packed with people who've got academic, personal, professional experience of the system. That said, there are already too many things I want to talk about, so I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to speak about. I'm not going to talk about all the things that keep me up at night, and they do. Some of the things that keep me up are ever longer sentences. That mean that my students at Warren Hill, if they were sentenced today, would be in for 30 rather than 15 years. And what that would mean for them and for their life chances. I'm not going to speak about what I think is a credibility crisis of an overwhelmingly white justice system failing to understand and then criminalising and imprisoning disproportionate numbers of Black and Asian people, particularly children. I'm not going to talk about the high rates of self-harm and suicide of people on remand, held with convicted prisoners. Oh no, my note's not working. Half of whom are ultimately found not to be guilty or whose sentences would be less than their time served. And I'm not going to talk about the increasing political interference of the executive in operations of the parole board and what that means for rehabilitation, release, let alone our constitution. These things keep me up at night, and I expect that we will be working on them in the years to come. I've decided that today is for the big picture, and as a newcomer, I'm going to focus on the politics of prison, which troubles me more than anything else. This is a critical time for prison reform. Though crime, with the exception of fraud, has been falling for the last 30 years, we find ourselves on the brink of what Anne Owers said 20 years ago was a prison building orgy. We've already imprisoned more people than anywhere else in Western Europe, bar Scotland, but while the political direction of travel north of the border is to question the value of prisons and to talk about the root causes of crime and to challenge penal populism, here, prison is the accepted answer. Our prisons were struggling before the pandemic, and it has undoubtedly exacerbated a dire situation. First, there was the lost opportunity. While other countries protected prisoners' lives by releasing, in some places, thousands of people on short sentences for non-violent offences, including women, here we released only 316 people, mercifully to zero criticism from the then opposition. Our only way to contain this virus has been to put people in cells, often for 23 hours a day. That stopped the spread of the virus, and it mostly worked. Only 195 prisoners have died to date, which is too many, but still much better than was predicted. But such extreme measures come at a huge cost. Education, work, therapy, external programs, all suspended. We recently surveyed all of our membership, thank you for those of you who responded, and our members include 1,000 people who are in prison and 1,000 other family members of people in prison. And the stories they told us were of isolation, hopelessness, crumbling mental health. Everyone mentioned mental health. While in the community, COVID feels like it's behind us, for many prisons in this country, people who don't have prison jobs are still locked up for 22.5 hours a day. It's in part because the prison came at a time of significant disruption to prison staffing levels. Many prisons now have 60, 70% of their staff only ever having worked in COVID prisons, which are basically when everyone was locked in their cell. So the prospect of opening cells up to people who've been isolated for so long with inexperienced staff is understandably cause for concern. Beyond COVID, pick up any copy of Inside Time or read any inspection report of the Chief Inspector of Prisons, and you cannot help but despair at the state of prisons. Overcrowding. John Howard, 150 years ago, was saying that people should be one person to a cell. And yet in this country, there are still 15,000 men who are in double cells, double bunked. Leaking roofs, rat infestations, cockroach infestations, drugs, low literacy, skyrocketing levels of self-harm, and more deaths in prison in the past year than any time since records began. Beyond mental health, access to healthcare is poor, particularly for women. And two recent shocking cases of babies dying to mothers giving birth alone in their cells, despite their cries for help. In one case, the vulnerable mother had to chew through her umbilical cord of the dead baby and wasn't found for 12 hours. I'm sorry if this shocks you. It is shocking. It should be shocking. Nobody thinks that this is acceptable. And there are certainly some very enlightened programs in prisons and governors which are run in ways to minimise harm, but the overall picture is really bleak. And while the number of children in prison has decreased, something to which the Howard League has proudly contributed, the percentage of children from ethnic minority backgrounds continues to grow unabated. Now 52%, with only 18% of the general population. We are locking black boys up in record numbers and locking them away for ever longer sentences. I know from our survey results and the letters of our many members in prison that they feel forgotten, disposed of, and severely, severely punished. Not by having their liberty taken away, but by their terrible conditions and prospects. Our system intends that all but 65 of them will one day be released, and yet we don't set them up to prosper. And many don't. 48% of people leaving prison will reoffend within a year, released often to homelessness, drug addiction, and little support. Last week's inspection report of HMB Bronzefield revealed that 65% of women are leaving to unsustainable accommodation. And I have lost count of the number of times I've been in meetings with the Chief Inspector of Probation where he raises yet again the fact that there are 70,000 people under the supervision of probation who have a problem with drugs, and yet only 3,000 a year are referred to drug treatment. People are being set up to fail. Most everybody is doing their best, but the system is in trouble. Far too many people for the state to properly care for, and despite some amazing initiatives from the third sector, resources spread far too thin to support most people away from crime when they leave prison. I'm not going to go on about all the problems. I highly recommend that you read Angela Kirwan. Angela, are you here yet? Yes. Angela Kirwan has written an amazing book called Criminal that's coming out next week. It will be all over the newspapers, so you should go get a copy and get to sign it. But it provides a comprehensive overview of what's wrong through amazing stories of people she's worked with and provides a really powerful case for change. The bottom line is that our prison system stands in crisis, and the answer of our government is to pile another 20,000 people into it over the next 4 years. And here context is really quite important. We all know that in 2010, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government oversaw one of the biggest state spending cuts since the Second World War. And ever since, COVID aside, the dominant fiscal policy has been ever more austerity. Drastic cuts to social support, quarter of government jobs gone, youth workers dealing with drugs the first to go, getting rid of boxing clubs, local support services, drug rehabilitation clinics, no longer funded. As ever, women and children bore the brunt and child poverty has soared. While the third sector has stepped up with kindness and generosity, it can't ever be a substitute for proper government provision. And the social scaffolding that holds society up has been swiftly and steadily dismantled. The justice system was also slashed. Ministry of Justice budget cut 40% in real terms, savaging the scope and amount of legal aid, Crown Prosecution System service loss funding, reduced sitting days, law centres were closed, a system on its knees. And even before COVID, there was a massive backlog in the Crown Court. The victims waiting for their day in court, all the anxiety and stress that involves, the degradation of evidence as memories fade, and defendants held on remand for years. Our legal team's been assisting an 18-year-old remanded to the high security estate in May 2019. His trial was repeatedly rescheduled due to problems with co-defendants during the COVID. He wasn't heard for 23 months. In January of this year, a 15-year-old boy contacted us and he'd been on remand for 9 months. His trial kept on being pushed back with no bail package in place. And thanks to the work of our lawyers, we managed to sort him out bail back in March. But this sort of delay has become the norm and thousands of lives are on hold. All of this is obviously exacerbated by economic impact of Brexit and COVID, and we now have a cost of living crisis. It means things are only going to get worse. More people are going to be poor and are going to struggle with all the desperation and poor choices that can bring. And in this context, rather than investing in the things that we know cut crime and keep communities safe, the answer is to build more prisons. Admittedly, they're going to be nicer prisons, some laudable programs for employment if you're lucky enough to be sent to one of them, but most people are not going to be. The building project alone is going to cost £3.1 billion. The same amount, as it happens, that Jacob Rees-Mogg last week announced will be saved in cutting 91,000 civil service jobs. And the prison building is also going to land future generations with ongoing costs. Currently £52,000 a year for a woman, roughly 30 for a man, and you could send a couple of kids to Eton for the cost of imprisoning one of the children who calls our helpline each day. In purely financial terms, it's madness. It then just becomes unconscionable when you consider that the government's own evidence shows that prison doesn't deter crime. On occasion, we've had prison ministers who acknowledge this. Government knows, for example, that short sentences are more likely to result in reoffending than community sentences, which cost a fraction of what it costs to keep a person in prison. And yet, magistrates' sentencing powers have just been increased to 12 months, meaning there are going to be more people serving short sentences. Time and again, big picture policy is developed against the evidence base. And let's be clear, reoffending costs £18 billion a year. That's the total cost of Crossrail since 2007, but every single year. And that's what happens when policy choices are made in the knowledge that they are going to result in feeding rather than disrupting crime and its cycles. It's a policy that creates victims of crime. Add to this the dismantling of a constitutional framework that protects people in prison, but also all the rest of us from government overreach. Recent years have seen judicial review, which allows us to challenge government decision-making, curtailed. Ongoing attacks on the independent judiciary, who've got a critical role as a check on executive power, and who are often the last point of call to protect the rights of people, including prisoners, whose sentences would become ever increased if it were up to the Attorney General, and who lack political power at the ballot box. Most urgently, obviously, is last week's announcement in the Queen's speech of a British Bill of Rights to replace the Human Rights Act. A lot's been said about the Human Rights Act, and I won't go into all its virtues. Suffice to say that it is, in my view, an elegant, balanced piece of legislation that has brought the protections of the European Convention of Human Rights to people in this country in a way that I know from my own practice other countries in Europe envy. In the criminal justice sphere, the Human Rights Act has allowed access to justice for victims of crime. It's required action by the police to investigate cases of domestic violence. It's protected children in custody from abuse. Yes, it provides rights to people in prison, and it should. Their lives are entirely controlled by the state. They are highly vulnerable, and it's right that their treatment by the authorities is subject to challenge. For example, late last year, we lost in the Supreme Court, and we've now submitted an Article 3 case in human integrating treatment, application to the European Court of Human Rights, on behalf of a 15-year-old who was held in segregation for 55 days straight, without access to education, no gym, no purposeful activity whatsoever. Any confident, mature democracy accepts that such challenges have a place, and when they don't, the whole system is put in danger. So this is the climate. 12 years of retrenchment from social investment that we know prevents crime, devastation of criminal justice infrastructure, curtailing of rights of all of us to challenge it. And then we're going to put 20% more people into prisons that we know devastate lives, knowing they feed rather than stop crime, and burdening the public purse for generations. And in this mess, where is Her Majesty's opposition? Are they calling for evidence-based policy? Are they criticising the government for locking up too many people, for feeding crime and creating more victims? Perhaps they're calling for more diversion and community sentences that we know reduce reoffending. Following the new prison build, are they pledging to decommission those older prisons that we know are disrespecter of people places? No. The opposition has declared this government to be soft on crime. It's accused it of being a government that only cares about criminals and not about victims. The opposition, we are told, will be the party of law and order. Apparently there are votes in it. I can see people shaking your heads. I'm with you. We don't have any policy development yet from the opposition, but the ambition appears to be to outflank the Conservative government on crime. And this isn't new as policy goes. The last sustained explosion of the prison population was overseen by the Blair government, which added its own 20,000 lives to the prison machine. They used ASBOs to criminalise children and people with mental health problems and introduced the appalling indeterminate sentence of imprisonment for public protection, or IPP sentence, in 2005. As many of you will know, this sentence saw more than 8,000 people imprisoned with a minimum jail tariff but no maximum for a range of crimes. Those in an IPP sentence were placed on licence indefinitely after release, meaning they can be recalled to prison for administrative breaches or anything else, and often are. It's resulted in untold suffering for people in prison, their families and children. The uncertainty and endlessness of the sentence has directly resulted in self-harm and suicide. The indirect cost to self cannot possibly be known. My dear friend, Lord Brown of Eton upon Haywood, has described the IPP sentence as the single greatest stain on our criminal justice system. And I'm sure he's right, and it remains. To its credit, the coalition government abolished the sentence in 2012. I will say to strong opposition from Labor, which accused it of releasing dangerous criminals. And yet 10 years later, we still have 3,000 people behind bars on IPP sentences, many of them for years, in some cases a decade over tariff. Late last year, Lord Blunkett, who was the Home Secretary who introduced the IPP sentence, declared that he'd got it wrong, and he called on his own party and the government to remedy the injustice. He was not supported by his own side. And pending a report of the Justice Select Committee, the government is not doing anything. The truth is that this is a country where neither of the main political parties is prepared to stick its neck out to pursue evidence-based, humane criminal justice policy. From time to time, we have a justice team, as we had a few years ago with David Gauke and Rory Stewart, who listen and take account of evidence, but they move on. Recently, I was momentarily delighted by the current Lord Chancellor at Five Wells when he declared that he didn't care if he was accused of being soft on crime, as long as the employment initiatives at Five Wells worked. An encouraging morsel, but the direction of travel remains punitive, the political dialogue completely depressing. The difficult truth is that crime is primarily a byproduct of social failure. Rather than invest in solve and address the unmet needs in society, it's vulnerable people, governments of both colours have sought to punish and imprison their way out of a mental health crisis, out of a drug crisis, and now the beginnings of a cost of living crisis. Rather than engage with what is known to be the drivers of crime, it's easier to engage in cheap talk about a law and order crisis. And we're really reaping the seeds of what we sow now, because across the system, but particularly in the courts to prison, there is a crisis of the gravest order. Challenges faced are immediate, but they're also likely to be far-reaching, and only a fundamental review of the pipeline between courts and custody and a sweeping reassessment of what the system's priorities should be is going to steer us away from a future doomed to decades of sclerotic, failing justice and prisons that continue to damage people and moulder at the fabric of society. Unfortunately, there's no sign that our politicians understand this. None of the political parties have a serious programme of reform when it comes to criminal justice. The two main parties appear to be committed to an arms race of political rhetoric that's going to put us back decades. They want to rely on naive assumptions that the answer to crime is ever-lengthening prison sentences for an ever-lengthening roll call of offences with no accounting for what that means, not just for criminal justice, but for the wider societal response to poverty, addiction and poor mental health that drives so much of what comes before court. Taking away a person's liberty is the most serious power of the state. It has got serious consequences for individuals, for their victims, for society. It comes at a huge personal cost. Mental health, physical safety, life chances, and the sense of self of thousands of people in prison. It rips families apart, takes parents away from their children and children away from their childhoods. It's serious business. And yet in this country, although I have to say not in my country of birth, but in this country, it is a well-worn playground for cheap political point scoring and vote grabbing. And that needs to change. That's why the Howard League, in my view, is so important. This is a system that requires opposition, and we are committed to providing that opposition, to providing challenge based on evidence and decency. And how do they get away with it? Well, because crime is driven by complex social problems. It takes time and investment to arrive at evidence-based solutions. Dealing with crime isn't easy. It's much easier just to tell people they're going to be safe if we lock all the dangerous people away. Unfortunately, dealing with crime isn't that simple. Focusing on just throwing more people in prison means the authorities don't have the bandwidth to deal with the support and treatment of the people who need it to become pro-social and to grapple with tough issues. And there are serious issues. I agreed with Nick Hardwick that prison reform has struggled to deal with difficult cases, particularly of violent men. And in responding to crime, we need to meet the public's legitimate concern about safety. But that's too important to be left to saying that putting more people in prison is the answer. The public tend to trust politicians, I think, because prisons are closed spaces. While often people are curious about life inside, most people don't have the opportunity to go into prison. Most people don't read Inside Time. Occasionally, a TV program like Jimmy McGovern's Time comes along and people get a prime-time glimpse of what life is like behind bars. But otherwise, prisoners are easily vilified and forgotten. Frankly, just as my ancestors were when they were put on ships and sent to the end of the earth. It's progress that 200 years on we're not doing that anymore. But we still shift social problems and difficult people. We put them out of sight and out of mind. We lock them up across the country, meaning the public is left with fear-mongering politicians and portrayals in the Daily Mail, rather than their own personal, more empathetic experience. In the words of 20 years ago of the US prison activist Angela Davis, prisons don't disappear social problems. I can see Shami smiling. They disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when human beings they're contending with are relegated to cages. I think the Howard League has an important ongoing role in bringing these people back into public view. I look forward to working with other people in this space to give a voice to the experiences of people banged up. And it comes at a time when the experiences of people who've been to prison, people with lived experience, are finally being valued as a real resource. Finally, for what it's worth, I suspect that politicians overstate the public's punitive bent. I don't know what questions they ask in their polling, but I think if you provide people with information about what causes crime and what prevents crime and how prison works and what it does to people, I have little doubt that the dial will move. There are people in communities up and down this country that know what it's like to live and experience crime, but equally, they know the damage that prison wreaks. These are people who understand that we all walk a very fine line. I'll be working with our staff and trustees and members over the next few months to refine the best possible contribution that the Howard League can make in this space. But I think you can expect us to be calling for intellectual honesty and moral courage in political discourse, to reinforce the evidence base through research and litigation, and to help open windows for the public into life in prison, communicating why prison's not the answer to crime. I'm hugely grateful to everyone who's warmly welcomed me in this new role, and I look forward to working with the pretty amazing people in this space, many of them driven to campaigning by their own personal pain and determination to right injustice. And I look forward to working with our members and supporters, including those members in prison and their families. This is my first speech at the Howard League. I very much hope when I'm giving my last in 35 years, when I'm 84, I'm not talking about myself anymore for a start, and I don't want to be talking about prison. I'm very much hoping that we'll have politicians who are honest about the drivers of crime and who don't shy away from policy that works, who respond to a public with a much better understanding about the realities of criminal justice, and that the government will be building communities rather than prisons. It's a tall order, but I'm made of tough convict stuff, and I've always been a fighter. I look forward to the challenge and to working with you on it. With that, I end my speech.